Now, as a continuation and sort of a part two to the last lecture series on the science of body mass control, let's now move on to a discussion on the exercise and nutritional considerations for body mass control. In particular, I want to focus on weight loss, but more importantly, weight loss quality, which is a concept largely focused on optimizing the changes in body composition as opposed to simply body weight. So as you might tell, I am alluding to changes in not only adipose mass, but also lean mass, more specifically muscle mass. So how do we maximize fat loss while maximizing muscle retention or even improvement of muscle mass is the question we will address in this lecture series. Now with that, we will discuss the current research on weight loss quality and answer the question of whether it is possible to retain or even improve lean mass during a state of caloric deficit. And to answer that question, I'm going to present some of the research that I've done in subjects undergoing severe caloric restriction and therefore deficit. Now, as a brief overview of the topics we are going to discuss today, first, I will go over the primary driver of weight loss, and this is a direct continuation of the last lecture series where we emphasize the importance of a caloric deficit. Second, I will introduce the role of exercise in weight loss endeavors and explain its contributions to a caloric deficit and also its long-term benefits in its maintenance of healthy body weight status beyond its role in caloric expenditure. Now, during this segment, I will introduce some popularized concepts in exercise such as the quote-unquote fat burn zone and fasted cardio, to name a few, and talk about some research that shows why these concepts may not be as it appears. Next, I will discuss the concept of weight loss quality and the role of nutritional and exercise strategies in that. And lastly, we will wrap all this up with some key take-home messages, some practical application information. So as alluded to earlier, the focus of this lesson is practical application with the knowledge we have gained thus far from the first lecture series. So the primary and the most critical question to lead us off here is, what is the main driver of body mass reduction? In other words, what is the most important factor? Well, first, we need to do a quick review of the last lecture series. You must remember that the only way for your body to lose mass is for the stuff that make up the mass of your body to somehow exit your body. The stuff that I'm referring to are fuel molecules such as fat that are stored in areas such as adipose. So in order for you to reduce the mass of your body, you need to exhaust more fuel mass than the fuel mass that you consume. This creates a negative balance between the mass going out versus the mass coming in. The fuel mass is exhausted in the form of CO2 and H2O upon oxidation of the fuels. Remember, during oxidation, the energy within the fuel molecules is released, and the molecule, which is made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, is broken up and converted into other molecules, CO2 and H2O. This is the law of conservation of mass. These two molecules, and thus the fuel mass, then exits the body through exhaling or through excretory fluids. So day after day, if there is more fuel mass going out in the form of CO2 and H2O than fuel mass coming in the form of your nutrients, your total body mass will decrease. This is as simple as the idea of reducing the mass of a container full of sand, for example. If I asked you to reduce the mass of the container, but you had to scoop sand out and scoop sand in, you would know that you would need to scoop more sand out of the container than scoop in to produce a net loss of container mass. A very simple concept to understand, right? This is the same concept of weight loss or body mass reduction. Now, as we emphasized in the last lecture, since fuel is a source of energy, we use a measure of energy to indirectly quantify the amount of fuel either being consumed or expended. So calories as a measure of energy is also used as a proxy for fuel mass. Since fuel mass would be very difficult to measure, especially the fuel mass being exhausted from your body. So caloric intake is fuel mass consumed and caloric expenditure is fuel mass exhausted from the body. With that said, if a net fuel mass deficit is required to reduce the overall mass of this container we call our body, this then means that a caloric or energy deficit is required to reduce body mass. So the answer to this question of what is the main driver of body mass reduction, the answer is a caloric deficit or energy deficit, also known as a negative energy imbalance. And as we illustrated earlier, a caloric deficit situation would be represented by this balance right here, tipping towards the left. Less fuel mass and thus calories consumed versus calories or energy expended. So just to reiterate, what is the main driver of body mass reduction? It is a caloric or energy deficit. Why? Because a caloric deficit represents a situation in which more fuel mass is being exhausted from the body in the form of CO2 and H2O than fuel mass being consumed in the form of carbs, fats, and proteins, your macronutrients, and stored in the body. Please be sure that you have a good understanding of this. Now for question number 2. To create an energy or caloric deficit, aka negative energy imbalance, which side of this balance scale below should be the main target? Energy expenditure or energy intake? So to create a negative energy imbalance, we would need to tip the scale to the left. And the only 3 ways to create this is 1, keep energy intake the same and increase energy expenditure. Keep energy expenditure the same and decrease energy intake, or 3, increase energy expenditure and decrease energy intake. Of course, many of you would say option 3 would be the most prudent approach to creating an energy deficit for the goal of weight loss, and yes, that is correct. But the question is asking, of the 2 sides, which one should be the main primary target? Should energy expenditure be the main target or energy intake? And the answer to this question, as is many questions in health and fitness, is it depends. You will find that many of the questions in our field is most appropriately answered by it depends. If you run into someone who is constantly giving you black and white answers to every question in our field, then I would advise you to be cautious. So it depends is the answer. So naturally, the follow-up question to this answer is, well, what does it depend on? So first, we need to remind ourselves that obese or overweight individuals generally have a high total daily energy expenditure or overall metabolic rate. Now, do you remember why this would be the case? Remember, adaptive thermogenesis. As a result of prolonged energy surplus and a positive energy imbalance, an individual would adapt to rebalance and reestablish energy homeostasis by increasing the left side of this balance scale. They are obviously going to experience weight gain, but also an increase in overall metabolic rate by an adaptive increase in resting energy expenditure, aka basal metabolic rate, or BMR for short. When that BMR adaptively increases, eventually this scale balances out again and energy homeostasis is reestablished. At this point, weight gain stops since now the body has adjusted its total energy expenditure via increase in BMR to roughly match the energy intake, and what was once an energy surplus is no longer a surplus since the body has adapted to this higher energy intake. Now, what this means is 1, the individual has a new and higher weight stable energy intake compared to before their weight gain, and 2, their total energy expenditure is now higher than before their weight gain due to adaptive thermogenesis as just described. And we know this increase in total energy expenditure was largely driven by an increase in BMR. Again, as an adaptation to a prolonged energy surplus for the purpose of re-establishing this energy balance or homeostasis. This is why obese individuals have a high BMR compared to their leaner counterparts. Now remember, BMR is the energy expended at rest and the energy required to run the body. Through the process of weight gain and adaptive thermogenesis, the boost in BMR means that their body requires more energy to simply run. What this also means is that obese individuals who have experienced weight gain to a previous energy surplus expend a lot of energy/calories compared to their leaner counterparts just by existing. You could go as far as to say that they are quote-unquote calorie burning machines. I suppose that is sort of the silver lining of obesity. So for obese individuals, their weight-stable caloric intake is relatively high, and their total energy expenditure via BMR is also relatively high. So let's look at one example scenario. This obese individual wants to lose weight and thus needs to create an energy deficit. Say they decided that they are not going to reduce their caloric intake below the weight-stable caloric intake, meaning they are not going to undergo a caloric restriction diet. Instead, they decide they want to increase energy expenditure to create an energy deficit. Well, the only two components of energy expenditure that is modifiable are diet-induced thermogenesis and thermic effect of activity. BMR is not modifiable, meaning there's nothing you can do to change your BMR acutely. Changes in BMR, as discussed earlier, is due to adaptation to a long-term energy imbalance. Now, in this scenario, the diet-induced thermogenesis isn't going to change because this individual does not want to change the diet. So the only thing that this individual can do to increase total energy expenditure is by increasing activity. This can be done in the form of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short, or exercise-related energy expenditure through formal exercise. So the question would be, does this work? Meaning, would this successfully create an energy deficit for this individual? The simple answer to this is yes, since this would increase total energy expenditure while the energy intake stays the same and thus creates an energy deficit, which again is conducive to weight loss. More fuel mass going out than fuel mass coming in. But the better question is this practical? And the answer to this is no. Now let's think about this. An obese individual likely wants to lose relatively a lot of weight, which means overall a large energy deficit would be required over time. Now, do you think that this large energy deficit can be created just by increasing exercise energy expenditure alone? Likely not. It would likely create a very small energy deficit, which would create a very slow rate of weight loss, which means more time is required to reach a healthy weight status. And as we know, when things take longer, the greater chance that you revert back to old habits. So what then is the most practical approach? Well, first of all, I don't mean to suggest that exercise is useless. It surely has its benefits to weight loss even beyond simply energy expenditure, which I will discuss later on. But it's not the most practical means of creating specifically an energy deficit for an obese individual because it contributes minimally to the total energy expenditure. Now, the most practical target for obese individuals is the right side of the balance, caloric or energy intake, meaning caloric restriction is the target intervention. You must understand that due to the prior adaptive thermogenesis to a prior caloric surplus, obese individuals are again quote-unquote calorie burning machines. In fact, in my prior research on severely obese individuals, which I will share later on, some subjects had a BMR of about 3,500 calories per day. Now, to give you a reference for comparison, an average for normal weight individuals is anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day. This is the reason why obese individuals can consume a very high amount of calories without gaining any more weight. It's again because their total energy expenditure has increased due to an adaptive increase in BMR to adjust for this higher caloric intake. Now imagine burning 3,500 kcals per day doing nothing. I mean, for me to expend 3,500 calories per day, I would need to exercise pretty hard for a very long time each day since my BMR is nowhere close to 3,500 calories per day. So as you can see in this example, obese individuals generally have a very high propensity to expend energy even without exercise. Okay, so just as a recap, if I asked a question asking why obese individuals have relatively high BMRs compared to their leaner counterpart, you should know that it is because of the prior adaptation to their current weight-stable caloric intake, which was once a caloric surplus intake before the adaptation took place. Okay, so the practical approach for this individual in this example would be to target the right side of this balance by decreasing their caloric intake below the current weight stable caloric intake. And again, the weight stable caloric intake is the caloric intake maintaining this energy balance or homeostasis. Now, this reduction in caloric intake below the weight stable caloric intake or below the energy homeostasis caloric intake is referred to in the science as caloric or energy restriction. Again, caloric or energy restriction is a reduction in caloric intake below the weight stable caloric intake, that caloric intake that maintains an energy homeostasis. You're reducing the caloric intake below that. Now, by engaging in a caloric restriction, in so doing, you are decreasing the amount of fuel mass coming into your body so that your body now needs to rely on endogenous fuel sources to meet energy requirements, which again is very high for this obese individual. In other words, the body is now in a state where the fuel mass stored inside the body endogenously is now the source of energy for the body. And through this, the fuel mass will be exhausted from the body as CO2 and H2O at a rate higher than the fuel mass coming into the body as macronutrients. Now, what about leaner individuals or those who are not obese or overweight with a comparatively normal BMR? Well, in this case, then yes, creating an energy deficit through increased exercise or thermic effective activity would be a practical approach since the energy intake is not comparatively high, and so restricting calories may not be practical for these individuals. But just understand the weight loss would be slow since the difference between energy expenditure and energy intake would be low unless, of course, you are expending a lot of energy through exercise. Okay, so let's talk about the thermic effective activity in much more detail and why this, being the target for producing a caloric deficit to induce weight loss, may not be the most practical approach, especially for obese individuals. Now, first, again, to remind you, this is not at all implying that exercise is useless or not recommended. We are talking specifically in the context of its role in producing a practical caloric deficit for practical weight loss. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the thermic effective activity can be broken down into two subcomponents: exercise energy expenditure and non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short. Now, as you can probably guess, the former is energy expended during exercise, and the latter is energy expended from just general activity like walking from the parking lot, getting out of the chair, going upstairs, etc. Now, both of these are modifiable, meaning at any given time you can increase or decrease energy expenditure related to exercise or activity. Now, although a caloric deficit can be created through increased activity, as I said before, it may not be the most practical for the general reason that it does not make a huge contribution to total daily energy expenditure and thus the caloric deficit, and thus weight loss would be slow, especially for obese individuals. So what are the limitations to increasing thermic effective activity as the only means of producing a caloric deficit? Okay, so what are the limitations to increasing thermic effective activity as the only means of producing a caloric deficit? First, the total amount of energy expended and therefore fuel mass expelled from the body during a typical bout of exercise is relatively minimal. Understand that even when someone is an avid exercise enthusiast, the exercise expenditure is still a small relative contributor to total daily energy expenditure. Now, as you can see here, thermic effective activity is roughly 30% of the total daily energy expenditure, and exercise energy expenditure is typically less than 50% of the thermic effective activity. So percentage-wise and also total caloric expenditure-wise, it would be a small contributor to a caloric deficit. Also, you have to understand that estimations of activity energy expenditure, like what you may gather from your fitness monitors or some formulations, are indeed estimations and may not be accurate measurements of the actual energy that is expended from physical activity. So these estimations are typically not a reliable or valid means of measuring your thermic effective activity. And thus, if you are trying to create a caloric deficit just by physical activity alone, you don't have the best objective tools to know whether you are indeed creating an energy deficit or at least a significant energy deficit through physical activity energy expenditure. Now, with all that said, if attempting to produce a caloric deficit through physical activity alone to observe a loss of mass at the adipose tissue level, which is obviously the goal of weight loss, a relatively long time will be required since the caloric deficit is relatively small, meaning there is not a whole lot of discrepancy between the total energy expenditure and energy intake if physical activity energy expenditure is the only means of producing a caloric deficit. Now, this means that the dietary intake or the caloric intake must be maintained in order for an energy deficit via exercise or physical activity to result in an observable body mass reduction. So because the rate of weight loss will be slow due to this small caloric deficit, this means that in order for one to experience a significant weight loss, that diet needs to be maintained for a very long period of time. That dietary intake can't go up, otherwise the deficit will be negated. Now, in addition to this, remember some lessons learned in my exercise physiology course. What is the adaptations to exercise training? Well, metabolically speaking, your body becomes generally more energy efficient. In other words, for a given level or intensity of exercise, the body expends less energy as the body adapts to that exercise over time. If you become more energy efficient, how do you think that would affect thermic effective activity, in particular, exercise energy expenditure? This would eventually lower the energy expended during exercise, which would not be conducive to maintaining a caloric deficit, again, because you are just much more efficient at performing that given exercise at that given intensity or level. Now, this means that exercise needs to be progressive as you adapt to the exercise and become more energy efficient at it. So for a practical example, say I was sedentary and obese and I did not alter my caloric intake. I decided to start exercising by running at 4 miles per hour for 30 minutes each day. Now, this created a small caloric deficit because I am expending more energy through exercise energy expenditure. Now, every other day I do the same workout, and over time my body is going to adapt to this exercise stressor since that is the normal response to training. You just get better and more efficient at it. So as I adapt to this 4 mile per hour 30-minute workout, I start to expend less and less energy for that workout because as an adaptation, I am becoming more energy efficient at it. So if I don't change my workout, the exercise energy expenditure becomes less and the caloric deficit becomes less, and therefore my rate of weight loss becomes less. So the only way I can create an energy deficit at this particular point, if I don't change my caloric intake, is if I add progression to my workouts. If I don't progress my workouts, then I can fall back into a state of energy homeostasis, which means no more weight loss. Even worse, I could fall back into a caloric surplus if I don't maintain the diet. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of physiological limitations to creating a caloric deficit just through exercise alone. Okay, so again, why is caloric restriction or reducing caloric intake below weight stable caloric intake? Why is that the primary target for producing a caloric deficit? Well, it's because obese individuals have a very high total energy expenditure because of a very high basal metabolic rate, or BMR, aka resting energy expenditure. Again, they are quote-unquote calorie burning machines even without exercise. Now, not only does BMR, or resting energy expenditure, account for the largest percentage of total daily energy expenditure, it is the largest caloric expenditure of the 3 components, as you can see in this figure. It accounts for about 60% of total daily energy expenditure, and as I said before, obese individuals have very high BMRs because of the prior adaptive thermogenesis to the prior energy surplus. Now, this is again going back to topics presented in the last lecture series. When you create an energy surplus over time, the body will reestablish energy homeostasis by increasing BMR. Now, the BMR will increase so that the total daily energy expenditure roughly matches the energy intake. At this point, weight loss stabilizes, and now what was once a caloric intake that produced a caloric surplus is now a caloric intake that produces caloric balance or homeostasis, which in turn stabilizes the weight because there is no more imbalance. So the weight stable energy intake or weight stable caloric intake, it's a caloric intake that is balanced with energy expenditure. So after a period of adaptive thermogenesis to a caloric surplus, especially a large surplus, not only have you gained a lot of weight, but you have also increased BMR. And thus obese individuals, as I said, have a relatively high BMR and a very high propensity to lose weight as long as the caloric intake is lowered. Again, they burn a lot of calories every day by just existing. So let's take an obese subject again as an example. For this subject to create an energy deficit via caloric restriction, they would first need to know their total daily energy expenditure / needs, since the caloric intake needs to be lower than this in order for a caloric deficit to be established. Now, many people utilize formulas to estimate what their caloric expenditure or needs are, and they base the restriction off of that estimation. This is an unreliable method. Now, many of these formulas include basic information such as body weight, height, age, and sex. I can guarantee you that one's metabolic rate or energy expenditure is dependent on many more factors than those 4 factors. And all the factors that contribute to one's metabolic rate or total daily energy expenditure cannot be accounted for in these estimation formulas. Oftentimes, people will turn to their fitness app and get an estimation of their total daily energy expenditure / needs. And it shows, for example, 3,000 kcals per day. So they decide, well, I'm going to then eat 2,500 kcals per day to create a deficit and to lose weight. Then they realize that no weight loss has occurred and they are left perplexed. This is usually the point where they turn to gimmicky diet programs because they feel their body doesn't respond to caloric restriction, and perhaps they say that their quote-unquote hormones are not quote-unquote right. Well, here's the thing. The caloric restriction was adjusted based on this estimated total daily caloric expenditure / needs. But what if, in reality, the total daily energy expenditure / needs was 2,500 kcals per day and not the estimated 3,000 kcals per day? So when the subject decided to eat 2,500 kcals per day, there was actually no caloric deficit. The intake matched the expenditure and thus no weight loss occurred. This happens a lot more often than you think. So what is a practical way to find out one's true total daily energy expenditure? Well, let's go back to what I said earlier. If this subject is weight stable, that means their daily caloric intake roughly matches their total daily energy expenditure. So if this subject consumed on average 5,000 kcals per day and they are weight stable, meaning they are under energy homeostasis, this means that their total daily energy expenditure is roughly about 5,000 kcals per day. And 60% of that is their BMR, which is roughly 3,000 kcals per day. So if this subject reduced their caloric intake to say 4,000 kcals per day, meaning a caloric restriction of 1,000 calories per day, they will be in a caloric deficit and weight loss would occur. So this means instead of trying to estimate the total energy expenditure, figure out the weight stable caloric intake to determine the total energy expenditure. Since weight stable means energy homeostasis, it's equal on both sides of the balance. Now, this is a method I've used in all my years of consulting, and I will say with good adherence, it has worked almost 100% of the time. I would have my clients maintain whatever their diet is for another 2 weeks, and I would have them weigh themselves without clothes on the same scale every day in the morning after first void, meaning they empty their waist. During these 2 weeks, I asked them to record everything they eat using either dietary logs or a mobile app like MyFitnessPal. From here, if they are weight stable for 2 weeks, the average daily caloric intake should generally match their total daily energy expenditure. And this is how I determine their total daily energy expenditure / needs. From here, I would then restrict the caloric intake. Now remember, as you restrict calories and you create a caloric deficit and lose weight, you will adapt. Your BMR will eventually decrease to reestablish energy balance. It will adapt to this lower caloric intake. So eventually you will weight stabilize. Oftentimes this occurs before the goal weight is met. So from here you have to decide whether to restrict more calories or expend more energy or both. weight plateaus will happen. This is just normal physiology of the human body. It's adaptive thermogenesis, so we simply don't die. Okay, so as you can see, creating a deficit is nothing fancy, no gimmicks, just reducing calories below your weight stable caloric intake, because the weight stable caloric intake should generally match your total daily energy expenditure / needs. Again, those who say caloric restriction does not work are oftentimes not actually restricting calories because they are overestimating their total daily energy expenditure / needs because they decided to, say, use an estimation formula or a fitness tracker. So in summary, use the weight stable caloric intake to better determine the total energy expenditure / needs. This is all evidence-based practice. This method should make sense to you because you understand the science of body mass control as discussed in the last lecture series.